The question hit Ezekiel Vaughn like a bullet he had not seen coming, which was saying something for a man who had survived more ambushes than he could count on both hands. Matilda Mercer stood in the doorway of her farmhouse with the late afternoon sun of 1883 burning gold behind her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her green eyes glassy with 3 years of unshed grief and fury, and something else she refused to name. The revolver she was pointing at his chest did not waver. Her hands had always been steadier than her heart, and right now her heart was doing something catastrophic inside her ribcage. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked, and her voice did not break, which was the greatest performance of self-control she had ever managed in her 27 years on this earth. Ezekiel stood at the edge of her porch, hat in hand, dust from 3 states still clinging to his coat, 3 years of hard roads and harder decisions carved into the lines around his dark eyes. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He looked at the barrel of that revolver the way a man looks at something that both terrifies him and feels entirely deserved. "I came back, didn't I?" he said. Not a question. A fact. The most devastating, infuriating, confusing, wonderful fact Matilda had heard in 3 years. The gun trembled now. Just slightly. Enough that he noticed, and enough that it told him everything he needed to know about whether she still felt something, which was the only piece of information that mattered more than his own survival at this particular moment. 3 years ago, Ezekiel Vaughn had ridden away from this farm, away from Matilda Mercer, away from the only place in the territory of New Mexico that had ever felt like it might become a home. He had left her with a lie, a broken promise, and the searing, unforgivable knowledge that he had chosen something over her, something dark. Something that had followed him from his past like a shadow he could not outrun no matter how many miles he put between himself and the man he used to be. He had ridden away believing it was the only way to keep her safe. He had come back believing the same thing was still true, only now the threat was gone, burned down to ash in a town called Redrock that no longer existed on any respectable map. And the only thing standing between him and the rest of his life was a woman with a gun and 3 years of justified fury. But to understand how Ezekiel Vaughn ended up standing on Matilda Mercer's porch with a heart full of reckoning, you need to go back to the spring of 1880, to the town of Caldero, New Mexico territory, where the dust was always red and the heat always personal, and where a drifter with a dark past first walked into a woman's story and refused to walk cleanly back out. Caldero was not a town that inspired poetry. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 sets of hills that kept the wind out and the heat in, and it had been built the way most frontier towns were built, which was quickly, and with the full expectation that it might not last. There was a main street with a general store, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a telegraph office, a jail that needed new bars, a church that needed new everything, and the land registry office where Matilda Mercer worked every weekday from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. Matilda had come to Caldero 4 years before Ezekiel ever laid eyes on her, arriving on a stage from Santa Fe with 2 trunks, a leather portfolio of surveying documents, and the freshly signed deed to a parcel of farmland 6 miles east of town that her father had left her in his will. She had buried her father in Santa Fe, sold the family house, packed up her life, and decided to do something with the land because doing something was the only antidote she knew to grief. She was 23 years old, and she was alone in the way that strong women often find themselves alone, not because no one wanted them, but because the people who did want them tended to want a version of them that had been made smaller and quieter and less certain. She planted corn. She hired 2 hands, brothers named Felipe and Marco Reyes, who were the best farmers in the valley and knew it, and she learned the land the way she learned everything, which was obsessively and without apology. She became good at it. The farm grew. The corn grew. The reputation grew. And by 1880, Matilda Mercer was known in Caldero as a woman of substance, which in 1880 in New Mexico territory meant people simultaneously respected her and were slightly afraid of her, and occasionally forgot that she was a person with a heart that could be broken. Ezekiel Vaughn arrived in Caldero on a Tuesday in April of 1880, which was significant only in that Tuesday was when the stage came through, and the stage from Albuquerque was how most drifters arrived. He did not arrive on the stage. He arrived on a dark bay horse named Calvin with a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, a Colt revolver, a saddlebag containing 3 days of provisions and one small leather-bound journal, and a reputation that had preceded him through 3 territories without ever quite catching up to the truth. He was 30 years old. He had a face that told you he had seen things he had not chosen to see, a jaw that said he could hold a secret indefinitely, and eyes so dark they looked black in certain light, except when something caught him off guard and surprised him, and then they went warm and human, and briefly unguarded in a way that made you want to say something surprising to him again, just to see it happen. He rode straight to the Copper Bell Saloon, which was where drifters always went first, and he ordered a whiskey and a meal, and he did not volunteer his name, and nobody asked because that was also the custom. He ate. He listened. And in the listening, he collected 2 pieces of information that he had been looking for. The first piece of information was that a man named Silas Greer had been seen in the area, specifically in the foothills north of Caldero, specifically in the company of 4 other men whose names nobody in the saloon seemed eager to say out loud. The second piece of information was that somebody in Caldero owned a parcel of farmland in the Eastern Valley that Silas Greer was reportedly very interested in acquiring, and that the somebody was a woman who kept refusing. Ezekiel Vaughn set down his whiskey glass and stared at the table for a long moment. Silas Greer. After 3 years of hunting, the name still landed in his gut like a stone dropped into deep water, the ripple going all the way down. He paid for his meal and his whiskey, and he asked the bartender, a heavyset man named Gus with kind eyes and a wary mouth, who the woman with the farmland was. "Matilda Mercer," Gus said, and then he looked at Ezekiel the way people look at men they cannot quite classify, men who might be good news or very bad news and whose category is not yet clear. "You got business with her?" "Not yet," Ezekiel said. He rode out to the farm the next morning. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself it was information gathering. He told himself he needed to understand the lay of the land before he made a move on Greer, which was true. But it was not the whole truth, and the whole truth was something he would spend the next several weeks refusing to examine directly. Matilda was in the cornfield when he arrived, walking the rows with her boots already dusty and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, making notes in a small ledger she carried. She looked up when she heard Calvin's hooves on the packed earth path, and she did not look afraid, which he noted. Most women alone on a farm in the territory, confronted with an unknown rider, showed some sign of fear. Matilda Mercer looked at him with the focused, assessing expression of someone calculating whether a new variable was going to be useful or a nuisance. "You are on my land," she said, "not aggressive, just informational." "I am," he agreed. "I mean to ask if you are hiring." "I have 2 hands already, good ones." "I work cheap," he said. "What does cheap mean?" "Bed and board and $1 a week." She tilted her head slightly and looked at Calvin, which was smart, because a man's horse tells you a great deal about him. Calvin was well kept, well fed, and had the confident bearing of an animal that was treated with consistency and respect. "What is your name?" she asked. "Ezekiel Vaughn." She wrote it in her ledger. He found that remarkable. She was recording him, making him real and documented, which was not what drifters usually wanted and which made him feel something he could not immediately name. "Can you fix a fence?" she asked. "Yes." "Irrigate a field?" "Yes." "Follow directions without needing them explained twice?" "Yes." "Do you drink?" "Occasionally and responsibly." She studied him for another moment, and then she said, "The bunkhouse is behind the main house." Felipe Reyes will show you the morning routine. You start tomorrow. If you cause trouble on my land, you will leave it. Understood, he said. He did not cause trouble. He fixed fences and irrigated fields and followed directions without needing them explained twice. And every morning for the first 2 weeks he was working for Matilda Mercer. He was also keeping very careful track of any movement in the foothills north of Caldero that might indicate Silas Greer's operation. Because Silas Greer was not just a man who wanted someone's farmland. Silas Greer was the man who had killed Ezekiel Vaughn's younger brother Daniel 3 years prior in the town of Tucson, Arizona Territory, shot him dead in the street over a gambling debt that had never been Daniel's to begin with, a debt manufactured by Greer as a pretext to take what he actually wanted, which was the Vaughn family's copper claim in the mountains outside Tucson. Ezekiel had been too far away to prevent it. He had not been too far away to hear about it. And from the moment he had received the telegram and read the 12 words that ended his brother's life in plain print, he had been moving towards Silas Greer with the quiet, purposeful momentum of a man who had decided on something and was not going to be turned from it. He had been hunting Greer for 3 years. And Greer had come to Caldero, apparently, because he had a habit of finding something he wanted, and then engineering a situation in which the person who owned the something was made so uncomfortable they gave it up. The farmland in the Eastern Valley was a perfect location for a cattle operation. Matilda Mercer had declined to sell it 3 times already by letter, and now Greer was in the foothills with 4 men, which Ezekiel understood was the escalation from persuasion to pressure. He needed to stop Greer before Greer did to Matilda what Greer had done to Daniel. What he had not planned for was Matilda herself. She was not what he had expected, and he had not expected much because expecting things from people had gotten Ezekiel Vaughn into trouble his whole life, and he had largely given up the practice. But Matilda Mercer exceeded the absence of his expectations in ways that unbalanced him continuously. She was sharp. Not sharp in the way people meant when they said it as a compliment with a slightly nervous edge, but genuinely, clinically, beautifully sharp in a way that meant she understood complicated things quickly and was not afraid of nuance. She read. She had a bookshelf in the farmhouse sitting room with 30 or 40 volumes including Mary Shelley and Charles Dickens, and a Spanish dictionary. She used to read the land records that came in from the old Spanish land grants in the area. She played chess against herself on a small board she kept on the kitchen table, and she played both sides seriously, which he thought was either eccentric or profound, and eventually decided was both. She was funny, though she deployed humor sparingly, like something precious. The first time she made him laugh, which was with an absolutely deadpan observation about the corn harvest and the inherent existential tragedy of being a scarecrow. He felt the laugh in his whole chest and looked at her with something close to alarm. And she was kind in a way that did not announce itself. He saw it in the way she treated Felipe and Marco, with respect and fair wages, and the kind of dignified acknowledgement of their labor that was far from guaranteed on the frontier. He saw it in the way she kept a tray of water and cornbread at the edge of the field for anyone passing through who looked hungry. He saw it in the way she talked to her horse, a gray mare named Josephine, not in baby talk but in the thoughtful, honest murmur of someone who believed that being heard mattered to all living things. He was in serious trouble by the end of the 2nd week, and he knew it, and he did not know what to do about it because he was there on false pretenses, carrying a dark secret and a darker mission, and Matilda Mercer deserved neither. The first real conversation happened on the porch on a Wednesday evening in May. Matilda had brought out 2 cups of coffee, which she did sometimes for herself and sometimes extended to whichever of her hands was in the vicinity, and Ezekiel happened to be nearby repairing a hinge on the porch railing. She set 1 cup beside him without comment and sat in the wooden chair she kept near the door. They were quiet for several minutes, which was comfortable in the way that quiet is only comfortable between people who have already, in some unspoken way, decided they trust each other's company. "You were not always a farmhand," she said eventually. It was not a question. He set down his tools and picked up the coffee. "No," he said. "What were you before?" A long pause. "A lot of things, not all of them good." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "That is a careful answer. It is the honest one." "Are you in trouble?" she asked, and there was no judgment in it, only the direct practicality of a woman who needed accurate information about her own situation. He considered the question very seriously and then said, "Not me specifically, but there may be trouble coming this way, and I intend to make sure it does not land on you." She was quiet for a moment. "Is the trouble named Silas Greer?" He looked at her sharply. "He sent another letter last week," she said calmly. "His fourth. The language is becoming less polite. He mentioned knowing what my farm was worth, which struck me as a veiled threat more than a compliment." "You should not be dismissive of it," Ezekiel said. "I am not dismissive of it," Matilda said evenly. "I have a rifle, a revolver, 2 farmhands who are excellent shots, and enough cornmeal to outlast any siege of reasonable duration. I am not dismissive. I am prepared." She paused. "But I would like to understand who you are and why you are here, Mr. Vaughn, because I do not believe it is the $1 a week." He set his coffee down and looked at the middle distance and made the decision that he would tell her something true, not all of it, but something real, because she had earned it with her directness and because lying to her felt like a crime. "Silas Greer killed my brother," he said, 3 years ago in Tucson. I have been looking for him since. I found out he was here. I came to make sure he does not do to anyone else what he did to Daniel." Matilda was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I am sorry about your brother." "Thank you," he said, and meant it with a completeness that surprised him. "Is there a law element to this?" she asked. "A sheriff, a marshal?" "The sheriff in Tucson filed a report. It went nowhere. Greer has money and he has people who will say whatever is necessary. The law in this territory is thin in certain places." Matilda nodded slowly. She understood territorial law and its limitations better than most people, given that she spent her working days in the land registry and had seen more than a few cases where the law was theoretically present and practically useless. "What is your plan?" she asked. "Find evidence that connects him to Daniel's death. Get it to someone who can act on it, a federal marshal if necessary. And in the meantime, I am a farmhand," he said. She looked at him for another long moment and then she picked up her coffee and stood. "You should know," she said, "that I do not like secrets. I can manage danger. I cannot manage not knowing the truth about the people around me." "I understand," he said. She went inside. He sat on the porch until the stars came out, which took a while because the New Mexico sky was extravagant about its sunsets, and he thought about Daniel and about Silas Greer, and about how complicated his situation had just become, and how much more complicated it was about to get. Over the next month, something grew between Ezekiel and Matilda that neither of them had the specific vocabulary for yet, because neither of them had been particularly good at allowing things to grow. It was built from small things, the way all real things are built. Coffee on the porch. Conversations that started practical and drifted into territory that was not. The evening she showed him how to read a surveying map, and the way their heads bent together over the kitchen table, and neither of them moved back when their shoulders touched. The chess. He had looked at the board one evening and asked if she always played alone, and she had said yes, and he had sat down across from her, and they had played until midnight with the lamp burning between them, and she had beaten him twice, and he had beaten her once, and they had both known by the end of the third game that something fundamental had shifted. She told him about her father, a surveyor who had loved the land with a reverence that bordered on spiritual, who had taught her to read contours and water tables and the language of dirt, who had also been the first person in her life to treat her intelligence as an asset rather than an inconvenience. She told him this carefully, like something that could still be bruised, and he received it with the gravity it deserved. He told her about Daniel, about growing up in Missouri, the two Vaughn boys, and a mother who worked herself half to death at a laundry, and a father who had been gone so long he was more absence than memory. About how Daniel had been the better of them, funnier and lighter and more given to hope, the kind of person who made every room better by being in it, and how the telegram had arrived and the room of the world had been permanently poorer since. She had reached across the table when he said this and put her hand over his for exactly 3 seconds, and those 3 seconds were the most intimate thing that had happened to Ezekiel Vaughn in longer than he could honestly remember. June arrived, and with it, the situation with Silas Greer began to move. Ezekiel had made contact with a man named Archie Flood, a former Pinkerton agent who now worked as a private investigator out of Albuquerque, and Archie had confirmed that Greer had a pattern: towns in 3 territories, properties he had pressured from their owners using manufactured debts or outright violence, a network of witnesses who had been paid or frightened into silence, and one surviving paperwork trail that ran through a bank in Santa Fe. The paperwork trail was the key. Ezekiel needed access to it, which meant he needed to go to Santa Fe, which meant he needed to leave Caldero for at least 10 days. He told Matilda he was going on a personal errand. She looked at him with those green eyes, and he knew she knew he was not telling her all of it, and he also knew she was giving him the room to not tell her all of it for the moment, which was a form of trust that made his chest feel complicated. "How long?" she asked. 10 days, maybe 12. "And you will come back?" Something in the way she asked it, not suspicious, not demanding, just a genuine, quietly vulnerable question that had more than practical logistics in it, and they both knew it. "Yes," he said. "I will come back." He went to Santa Fe. He met with Archie Flood at a hotel on Alameda Street, and they spent 4 days working their way through the banking records that Archie had obtained through methods that were technically legal if you did not examine them too closely. And they found what they were looking for: a paper connection between Greer's land acquisitions and Daniel Vaughn's death. Money that had moved through Greer's accounts in a pattern that told the story clearly to anyone who knew how to read it. Payments to a man named Cole Pruitt, who was currently serving time in Yuma Penitentiary in Arizona Territory for an unrelated crime, and who might, if approached correctly, be willing to provide testimony in exchange for considerations regarding his sentence. It was not a complete case, but it was a beginning. It was enough to take to a federal marshal. Ezekiel sent a telegram to the marshal's office in Albuquerque, a man named Charles Reeves, who was known for being both effective and incorruptible, which was a rarer combination than it should have been. Then he rode back to Caldero. He arrived on a Wednesday evening to find the farmhouse lit, and the smell of something cooking drifting across the yard, and Matilda standing in the kitchen doorway watching his approach with an expression he could not fully parse, and which made his heart do something irrational. She had made dinner. It was not a special occasion dinner. It was beans and cornbread and salt pork, but it was made with attention and set out with care, and he understood it as the specific language of a person who expressed feeling through the practical, which was a language he spoke fluently. They ate, and she asked about his trip, and he told her more than he had before, not everything, but enough that she understood the shape of what he was doing, and she listened in the focused way she always listened, and when he was done she said, "When will the marshal come?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "And Greer in the meantime?" "Greer does not know what I have. He thinks he is still in the process of wearing you down." "He will be disappointed," she said, without emphasis, as though the disappointment of Silas Greer was a minor inconvenience she had already factored into her schedule. He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them, and something shifted in him irrevocably, like a door that had been held shut for a long time finally moving on its hinge. And he thought, "I am in love with this woman," and then immediately thought what a completely catastrophic development that is. He did not say it. He was not ready to say it, and she was not ready to hear it, and the situation was too unstable, and there were too many secrets still between them. specifically one very significant secret that he had not yet told her and which had been the stone in his boot for weeks. The secret was this. Silas Greer knew who Ezekiel Vaughn was, not from the hunting but from before. 7 years earlier, before Daniel's death, before the drifting, before any of this, Ezekiel Vaughn had briefly ridden with a crew that Greer had employed to move cattle through New Mexico territory. He had not known at the time that the cattle were stolen. When he had found out, he had left. But he had been there and Greer knew his face, and if Greer found out Ezekiel was in Caldero, Greer would know immediately what it meant. It also meant that Ezekiel's past was not pristine. He had made choices he was not proud of. He had been, for a brief and ignorant period, adjacent to the kind of criminal enterprise he now spent his life opposing. He was not the clean hero of this story. He was a man who had done wrong and then spent years trying to do enough right to balance the scale, which might not have been exactly possible but was the only project available to him. He needed to tell Matilda. He knew he needed to tell Matilda. He kept finding reasons to postpone it because each time he thought about the expression that might appear on her face when he told her, the one that meant her trust had been misdirected, he felt a specific variety of cowardice settle over him that he was deeply ashamed of. What happened instead was that Silas Greer came to the farm. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-July. Ezekiel was in the far field with Felipe when Marco came running with his face tight and serious, and said there were 3 riders at the main house, and one of them was the man who had been sending the letters. Ezekiel ran. He came around the corner of the barn to find Matilda on the porch steps, standing straight, her arms loose at her sides in the specific posture of someone who was completely ready to go for a weapon, facing 3 men on horseback. The man in the middle was Silas Greer. Greer was 50 or so, lean and weathered, with a silver mustache and pale gray eyes that had the flat quality of eyes that had decided long ago to stop registering the humanity of other people. He sat his horse with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with having power over a situation. He had not yet looked to the side of the barn where Ezekiel stood. "Miss Mercer," Greer was saying in the pleasantly reasonable tone of a man who considered pleasantness a strategy, "I have made you a very fair offer on 4 separate occasions. I am running out of patience for pleasantness." "Then save yourself the effort," Matilda said. "The answer is no. It will continue to be no. I would appreciate if you took your men and your letters and your patience and left my property." Greer's pale eyes moved slowly, cataloging the farm, the barn, the fields. Then they moved to the side of the barn and found Ezekiel Vaughn. The recognition was instant. Ezekiel watched it happen, watched those pale eyes sharpen and narrow and rearrange the situation into a new configuration. "Well," Greer said softly, "Zeke Vaughn." Matilda's eyes moved immediately to Ezekiel. He could feel the weight of her gaze from 30 feet away. "Greer," Ezekiel said. "I had wondered where you had gotten to," Greer said, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now, replaced with something colder and more honest. 3 years since Tucson. Word was you had decided to make a problem of yourself." "Word was right," Ezekiel said. Greer looked between them and a small, unpleasant smile appeared. "So that is how it is. You came here for me and you found yourself a woman along the way, or did you come for the woman first?" He looked back at Matilda with a calculating expression. "Has he told you, Miss Mercer, that he used to work for me, before he developed a conscience?" The silence that followed was enormous. Matilda said nothing. Her face was completely still, the stillness of someone receiving information and choosing not to show the impact until they have finished receiving it. "Get off my land," she said to Greer. Greer held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at Ezekiel. "This is not finished," he said, and it was very much not a statement about the farmland. Then he turned his horse and his 2 men followed him and they rode north toward the foothills. Ezekiel stood where he was. He could not look at Matilda directly yet. He heard Felipe and Marco return to their work with the careful discretion of men who understood when something private was happening. "Come inside," Matilda said. Her voice told him nothing. That was the most frightening thing. They sat at the kitchen table. The chess board was between them. She did not offer coffee. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with those green eyes that saw things clearly whether you wanted them to or not. "You worked for him," she said, 7 years ago. "Before I knew who he was or what he did. When I found out, I left. Before your brother was killed. Yes, 3 years after I left, he killed Daniel." She was quiet. He watched her processing, rearranging, examining the shape of everything she knew about him against this new piece. "Why did you not tell me this?" she asked. "Because I was afraid of exactly what I am seeing on your face right now." "What are you seeing on my face?" "You deciding whether you can trust me." A long pause. "That is a fair fear," she said, "because that is what I am doing." She looked at the chess board. "Was anything you told me untrue?" "No, you simply left things out." "Yes." "That is still a form of deception, Ezekiel." "I know that," he said. "I am sorry for it." Another silence. She stood and went to the window and stood there looking at the fields with her arms crossed, and he waited, which was the only thing he could do, and the waiting was its own kind of suffering. "What are you going to do about Greer now that he knows you are here?" she asked. He exhaled. "The federal marshal is on his way. Archie Flood sent a second telegram yesterday confirming it. Marshal Reeves should arrive within the week, and if Greer moves before that, then I deal with it." She turned from the window, "with violence, if necessary." She looked at him for a long moment. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I have built this farm and this life and this self entirely on my own, with no one to answer to and nothing I did not earn. I do not need rescuing. What I need is honesty." "I know," he said. "Can you give me that, all of it, from here forward?" "Yes," he said, "all of it, whatever you want to know." She studied him for another long moment, and then she uncrossed her arms and something in her posture shifted slightly, the way something shifts when a decision is made. "Then tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, all of it," he told her. He was there for 3 hours at that kitchen table, and he told her everything: the crew, the cattle, finding out the truth, leaving Daniel, the telegram, the years of hunting, the Pinkerton man in Albuquerque, the banking records. Every piece of the dark past laid out on the table between them like the surveying maps she used to read the land, the contours visible, nothing hidden. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which was the greatest gift she could have given him. When he was done, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Thank you for telling me." "Are we all right?" he asked, and the question came out more raw than he intended. She looked at him. "Ask me again in a week," she said, but there was something in it that was not a dismissal but a request for time, and he took it as such. The week was complicated. Greer made 2 more approaches, once by letter and once by sending one of his men to the edge of the property line with a verbal message that amounted to a very thinly veiled threat. Matilda sent the man back with a written response that was essentially a single sentence, which was that she had retained legal counsel in Albuquerque, and any further approaches would be treated as harassment under territorial law. She had not, in fact, retained legal counsel in Albuquerque, but she had drafted the letter with such authority and specificity that the bluff was extremely convincing, and Ezekiel had watched her write it from across the kitchen with something very close to awe. Felipe and Marco kept watch at night in rotating shifts. Ezekiel kept his Winchester within arm's reach. The farm continued its daily operation because Matilda absolutely refused to allow Silas Greer to disrupt the harvest schedule, which was coming up and which represented 8 months of labor and everything she had. On the 5th evening of that week, they played chess again. She won the first game handily. He won the second by a margin of pure luck and a poorly considered knight move on her part that she blamed on being distracted. The third game went long and was still in progress when the lamp burned low and she got up to add oil, and when she came back to the table she paused behind his chair for a moment and then put her hand on his shoulder briefly, and he felt it like a current. "Ask me again," she said. He looked up at her. "Are we all right?" "Yes," she said. "We are all right." She sat back down and moved her bishop and said, "Check." and he spent the next 10 minutes trying to find a way out of it, which there was not. Marshal Charles Reeves arrived on a Friday morning, riding into Caldero with 2 deputies and the bearing of a man who took his authority seriously and did not feel the need to display it. He was 55, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and had been a federal marshal for 20 years, and had the particular brand of calm that long experience with dangerous situations tends to produce. Ezekiel met him at the marshal's office in Caldero, where Archie Flood was already waiting with the documentation from Santa Fe. The 3 of them spent 4 hours going through it, and by the end Marshal Reeves had a case in hand and a set of deputies assigned to making contact with Cole Pruitt in Yuma Penitentiary. "This will take time," Reeves said. "I want Greer to stay in the area. I do not want him spooked, and I want the woman on that farm kept safe while we build this out." "She is not easy to keep safe," Ezekiel said. "She prefers to do it herself." Reeves looked at him with the experienced gaze of a man who understood exactly what was meant by that. "Then keep her company," he said. The next 3 weeks were, in the context of everything else that was happening, something close to beautiful. The corn harvest began, which meant 14-hour days and every hand needed, including Ezekiel, and Matilda worked alongside all of them in the fields with her sleeves rolled, and her hat pulled low and her notebook in her pocket for when they took breaks. And there was something about shared labor under an open sky that stripped away pretense more thoroughly than any number of evening conversations. He watched her manage the harvest with a competence that was almost musical, the coordination of people and timing, and the specific knowledge of when and how and which. And he thought about what it would be like to be the kind of person who was a fixture in this landscape rather than a figure passing through it. And the thought was both wonderful and terrifying. On the 3rd evening of the harvest, sitting on the porch in the particular exhausted peace of a day's hard work done well, with the smell of the fields and the night coming on and the stars making their extravagant New Mexico appearance, Matilda said, "What do you intend to do after this? When Greer is dealt with?" He looked at her. The question was careful and the care was the important part. "I had not planned past this," he said honestly. "I have been planning toward this moment for 3 years. I do not have a clear picture of after. Where will you go?" A pause. "I do not know yet." She was looking at the horizon. "You could stay," she said, and said it in the exact tone of a person who is not going to repeat the offer or soften it or repackage it if it is not well received, just a clear and honest statement of a thing being available. He was quiet for a long time. "Matilda," he said. "You do not have to answer tonight," she said. "I want to answer tonight," he said. "I just want to answer it right." She looked at him. "I have not been anywhere long enough in 3 years to call it a place," he said. "I have been a body in motion with a destination and nothing else. And then I came here, and for the first time in 3 years, every morning when I got up I knew where I was, and it felt like something. It felt like somewhere." He stopped. "You feel like somewhere," he said, "and I have not known what to do with that." She was very still. "I know I am not uncomplicated," he said. "I know I have a past and secrets I should have told you sooner and a history that is not clean. I know all of that. But I also know that I want to be here, if you will have me." Matilda turned and looked at him in the lamplight from the window, and she said, "You are the most honestly complicated person I have ever met, Ezekiel Vaughn, and yes, I will have you." He reached across and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way in the dark for a long time with the stars overhead and the fields around them and the sound of the night. What happened afterward happened quickly, and not in the order anyone would have chosen. Silas Greer made his move 2 weeks later, before Marshal Reeves had completed his case, before Pruitt had been formally deposed, in a way that suggested either Greer had gotten wind of the marshal's investigation or he had simply run out of patience. He came to the farm at night with 4 men, not to the main house but to the cornfields, and what they had with them were torches. Ezekiel saw them from the bunkhouse. He was on his feet and across the yard before the first torch was lit, shouting for Felipe and Marco, and Matilda was out of the farmhouse 30 seconds later with her rifle in hand, and her hair loose, and her face set in an expression of such cold fury that it stopped two of Greer's men in their tracks. What followed was tense and mercifully brief. Greer's men had not counted on three well-armed people who were angry instead of afraid, and the single warning shot that Matilda put into the air, fired with complete controlled precision, appeared to recalibrate their risk assessment considerably. Greer himself held his position on horseback at the edge of the field for a long moment, staring at Ezekiel across 20 feet of dark air, and in that moment there was everything between them, Daniel and the cattle and the years and the blood and all of it compressed into a look that said the reckoning had not happened yet, but it was very close. "This is not over," Greer said. "It is over enough for tonight," Ezekiel said. Greer and his men rode off. Nobody slept after that. Ezekiel sent Marco into Caldero at first light to send a telegram to Marshal Reeves with a full account, and by midday, there was a return telegram saying that Reeves and both deputies were on their way and would arrive by nightfall. They arrived at 7 in the evening, and the arrest of Silas Greer took place at 9 the following morning, at the lodgings he had taken in a boarding house north of Caldero, and it was handled with the clean efficiency of a marshal who had been doing this for 2 decades and knew how to close a trap without leaving room for error. Greer went without violence, which was the surprise of it. He went with the pale-eyed composure of a man who had known this was a possible outcome, and had decided to meet it with the same dispassionate performance he brought to everything else. He looked at Ezekiel once as the deputies brought him out to the waiting horses, and the look was not remorse and not apology, but something flat and acknowledging. The look of a man who understood that Ezekiel Vaughn had outmaneuvered him, and was filing that fact away for whatever use it might eventually have, which was a terrifying quality that was fortunately about to become the federal government's problem. Cole Pruitt gave his testimony in Yuma Penitentiary 6 weeks later. The trial in Albuquerque took place in December of 1880, and Silas Greer was convicted of the murder of Daniel Vaughn and 4 additional charges related to fraudulent property acquisition and the employment of violence in the execution thereof. He was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary, which given his age amounted to the rest of his natural life, and Ezekiel received the telegram containing the verdict while sitting at Matilda's kitchen table in the middle of a chess game. He read it twice. Matilda watched him read it and did not ask what it said because she could see on his face exactly what it said. He set the telegram on the table. He looked at the chess board for a long moment, and then he looked up and found her eyes already on him with the particular softness she allowed herself only in private and only with him. "It is done," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up from the table and she stood at the same moment, and they met in the middle of the kitchen, and he held her for a long time, his face in her hair, her hands flat against his back, both of them standing still while something enormous settled. "I need to visit his grave," Ezekiel said into her hair. "Daniel's in Tucson before Christmas." "I know," she said, "and I will be here when you come back." "You should come with me," he said, pulling back to look at her. "If you are willing, I would like to introduce you to him. It sounds strange, but I would like him to know about you." Matilda looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face that was not quite crying but was related to it. "I will come with you," she said. They went to Tucson in November, which was when the desert was at its most bearable, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look like a painting. They stood at Daniel Vaughn's grave in the Tucson cemetery, and Ezekiel talked to his brother in the quiet, specific way that people talk to the dead, telling him things he needed him to know, including about Matilda, who stood beside him with her hand in his and her head slightly bowed. And she also said something, quietly, just a few words, and Ezekiel did not ask what they were because some conversations are private even between the living. They stayed 2 days in Tucson and visited the places Daniel had known, and Ezekiel told stories about his brother that made Matilda laugh and some that made them both quiet. And by the time they rode back toward Caldero, There was a quality of completeness to the air between them, a sense of something having been properly concluded and properly honored. The proposal happened in February of 1881 on the porch of the farmhouse, with the desert winter doing its mild best to be atmospheric, which mostly meant a clear, cold sky and a frost on the ground that would burn off by 9. Ezekiel had been thinking about it for weeks and had decided that an elaborate set piece would not suit either of them and that what was needed was honesty in the plainest form. He simply said, "I want to marry you, if that is something you want." Matilda considered this for a moment with the same focused attention she gave to everything important. "It is something I want," she said, "with conditions." "Name them," he said. "The farm remains in my name. The decisions about this land remain mine. I am not interested in becoming someone's property or someone's dependency. I am interested in a partnership." "Those are not conditions," he said. "Those are just the truth of the situation." "Good," she said. "Then yes." They were married in April of 1881 in the Caldero church that needed new everything, and the church had been partially repaired by then because the community had chipped in, and because Matilda had donated both labor and lumber, and because sometimes things get fixed when enough people decide they should be. The Reverend Martin Solis, who had been doing the Lord's work in Caldero for 12 years with minimal support and considerable stubbornness, performed the ceremony with warmth and economy. Felipe and Marco were there, and Gus from the Copper Bell, and Archie Flood, who had ridden in from Albuquerque for the occasion, and a dozen or so townspeople who had come to respect Matilda Mercer over the years and who were variously delighted and surprised to see her marry a drifter, and who, to their credit, were mostly delighted. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself from blue fabric she had ordered from a catalog, a simple cut, well made, completely without fuss, and she looked so beautiful in it that Ezekiel, who had been preparing himself for this moment and believed he was ready for it, was briefly unable to speak. She looked at his face when he saw her and laughed, which was the best sound. They said the words and they meant every syllable. The year that followed was the beginning of the actual life. Ezekiel became a genuine working partner on the farm, which involved the complete surrender of any remaining pride about being bad at things, because there were a great many things about farming that he was bad at, and Matilda was not inclined to pretend otherwise, though she was generous in the teaching. He learned the corn and the irrigation and the specific economy of a working farm in the New Mexico territory, the costs and the weather and the market and the politics of land, and he brought to it the problem-solving thoroughness of someone who had spent years surviving by being observant, and the combination of their two approaches turned out to be more effective than either would have been alone. They fought occasionally. This was inevitable and healthy. Matilda had opinions that she held with conviction, and Ezekiel had a tendency toward unilateral decision-making born from years of acting alone, and these two things collided periodically with the productive force of opposing weather systems. The arguments were honest and direct, and usually resolved at the kitchen table with coffee, and the chess board neither of them was actually interested in playing in those moments, but which served as a neutral object to focus on while they talked. He loved her in a way that continued to surprise him with its specific texture. It was not the grand, vague romance of the dime novels that occasionally appeared in the general store. It was detailed and daily and rooted in the specific reality of who she was, her sharpness and her practicality and her humor and her grief and her stubbornness, and the way she looked at him sometimes with the completely unguarded expression that she reserved only for him, and which made him feel that being known was the best thing that could happen to a person. She loved him in a way she had not expected to love anyone, not because she had given up on love, but because she had so thoroughly learned to manage without it that she had begun to assume management was sufficient. What she discovered was that love did not make her less competent or less independent, but made her more entirely herself, which was a discovery that delighted her in a way she expressed primarily through the quality of her listening when he talked, and the specific care she took with his feelings, which was the most intimate thing she had ever done. In the summer of 1882, Matilda told Ezekiel she was expecting their first child. She told him over breakfast in the practical, direct way she told him important things, which was clearly and without preamble. He sat very still for a moment and then reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you all right?" He asked first, because he knew her well enough by then to know that the first concern would be her own body's well-being and competence, and it was important to him that his first question be about her. "I am very well," she said, "tired and occasionally nauseated, but well." "Good," he said, and then the feeling hit him fully and completely, the enormous, terrifying, beautiful fact of it, and his eyes went bright and he held her hands tighter and she squeezed back and said, "Do not cry, Ezekiel Vaughn," in a tone that was pure affection. "I am not crying," he said, and was extremely nearly lying. A son was born in January of 1883 on a cold night that turned warm and clear by morning. He was delivered with the help of Caldero's doctor, a meticulous older man named Dr. Albert Pine, who had delivered half the children in the valley, and the experience was the most frightening 8 hours of Ezekiel's adult life, which was saying a great deal given that his adult life had featured a substantial amount of genuine danger. Matilda, for her part, was fierce and focused and thoroughly herself throughout, which Dr. Pine noted was the most useful disposition a woman in her situation could have. The boy was healthy and loud and had dark eyes exactly like his father's. "What shall we call him?" Ezekiel asked, holding the baby with the careful incredulity of a man who has never held a newborn before and is deeply aware of his own inexperience. Matilda looked at her son and then at her husband. "Daniel," she said. He looked up at her. "If you agree," she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Yes," with the full weight of everything that name carried, and Matilda reached up and touched his face briefly with her hand. Daniel Mercer Vaughn grew into his name with the relentless enthusiasm of a child who has been loved correctly from the beginning. It was the spring of 1883, when Daniel was 3 months old, that Ezekiel disappeared. Not disappeared in the way of drifters who drift, not disappeared in the way of cowards who run. He disappeared in the way of a man who has found out something terrifying and made a very wrong decision about how to handle it. The information arrived through Archie Flood, via telegram, sent to the Caldero telegraph office where Matilda found it because Ezekiel was not in town that day. She did not open it because it was addressed to Ezekiel, but the telegraph operator, a well-meaning young man named Thomas, told her it had come from Albuquerque and looked urgent. She waited. Ezekiel came home and read the telegram at the kitchen table, and his face went to a still, unreadable expression she had not seen since the earliest days. "What is it?" she asked. "Business with Archie," he said, which was the first time he had lied to her directly, and she knew it immediately because she knew him entirely by then, the specific texture of his honesty and the way it felt different from its absence. "Ezekiel," she said. "It is nothing to worry about," he said. "I will be back in a few days." He left the next morning before she was awake, which he had never done before, and the cold she felt when she found the empty side of the bed was followed quickly by anger, and the anger was followed by fear, and the fear was the one she tried hardest not to name. What the telegram had said was this: that a man named Rupert Coyne, one of Greer's former associates who had escaped the Albuquerque prosecution, had made a statement to a criminal contact in Albuquerque that he intended to pursue, in Coyne's exact words, a conversation with the woman on the Caldero farm, and that the conversation was meant to send a message to Ezekiel Vaughn about the cost of interfering in the affairs of serious men. Ezekiel had read this and felt the cold, complete terror of a man who understands that the danger he carries has been redirected at the person he loves most in the world, and in that terror had made the terrible, wrong, well-intentioned decision that the only way to protect Matilda was to draw Coin's attention away from Caldero and toward himself, which meant leaving and not telling her why, because telling her meant arguing and arguing meant delay, and delay might mean Coin arrived before he could redirect the threat. He rode toward Albuquerque to meet Archie Flood and to draw Coin away. And he was gone for 3 days, and then a week, and then 2 weeks, and the weeks became a month, and the month became 3, and then the months began to stack in ways she had not imagined, and no telegram came and no letter came, and Matilda Mercer Vaughn sat in her farmhouse with her infant son and the absence of her husband, and did what she always did, which was manage. She managed ferociously. She ran the farm. She raised Daniel. She made every decision there was to make, and she made them well, and she did not allow herself to collapse, because collapsing was a luxury the situation did not offer. But at night, in the dark, with the baby asleep in the room next to her and the lamp turned low, she felt the specific variety of betrayal that comes not from cruelty, but from a person making an enormous decision about your life without asking you, the being protected without consent, the being managed rather than trusted. She felt it as hot and real as any wound. And she felt the grief of it too, underneath the anger, the grief of a woman who had decided to love someone completely and who had believed, because she had every reason to believe, that she was not alone anymore. She did not know where he had gone. She did not know why. She knew only the fact of his absence and the fact of the empty chair at the kitchen table, and the fact of a chess board neither of them had touched in 3 months. The seasons changed. The summer corn came in. Daniel grew from infant to something that sat up and grabbed at everything and laughed with his whole body the way his uncle apparently had, according to the stories his father had told. He looked at everything with those dark eyes and was categorically delightful, which was simultaneously the best thing and the hardest thing because Ezekiel was not there to see it. And then it was October, 3 months into Daniel's life, when Matilda heard hooves on the path and went to the window and saw a dark bay horse she recognized. She was at the door before she knew she had moved. He looked worn. 3 months of hard roads had their own specific mark, and he wore them in the set of his shoulders, and the lines of his face, and the careful way he moved his left arm, which suggested an injury that had healed but had not fully healed. He stood at the edge of her porch with his hat in his hand and Calvin tied at the post, and the late afternoon sun doing that gold thing it always did. He was there. He had come back. And she looked at him with 3 months of grief and fury and relief and love all competing for the same space in her chest, and she said, "Do you believe in second chances?" Because that was all of it, everything, the real question beneath every other question. Did he believe that what he had done could be answered for? Did he believe they were still worth fighting for? Did he believe that she would trust him again, and did he believe he deserved her too? And he said, "I came back, didn't I?" and the gun came up. Because she was not going to make this easy, and he would not have wanted her to. They stood like that for a long moment, the gun between them and the afternoon sun and everything they were to each other, and then she said, "Get off your horse. Come inside. You have a son who does not know his father's face." He blinked. It hit him somewhere vital, those words, and she watched it happen and did not soften toward it immediately because she was still very angry and intended to remain so for a specific and appropriate amount of time. He came inside. Daniel was in the small crib near the kitchen window, where the light came in warm in the afternoons, and Ezekiel stood over him and looked at him for a long time with an expression that Matilda could not in good conscience deny was devastating in its entirety. The expression of a man confronted with proof of his own life in its most irreducible form. Daniel looked back at him with complete infant composure and then appeared to make a decision about the situation and grabbed for the finger Ezekiel had let him find. "His name is Daniel," Matilda said. Ezekiel looked at her. He was trying not to cry and not entirely succeeding, and normally this would have been her cue to reach out to him, but she held herself at distance because there was still the matter of the 3 months and the empty chair and the thing he had done. "Matilda," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Put him down. Sit at the table. Tell me where you were and why you left without telling me, and say it all truthfully or do not bother saying it." He put the baby down carefully and sat at the table and told her. All of it again. Coin and the telegram and the decision he had made, the reaching of Albuquerque and the meeting with Archie Flood, and the 3 weeks of maneuvering Coin toward a confrontation he could control, and the confrontation itself, which had gone wrong in the specific way. These things go wrong when the people involved are desperate. And Archie Flood had gone for the sheriff, and the sheriff had taken them both into custody while the matter was sorted out, which had taken another 4 weeks because territorial justice moved at its own pace. And by the time Ezekiel had been released and cleared and been able to move, the road back had been long and had included the arm injury from the confrontation, and a period of recovery that had cost him another month. He had sent a telegram. He told her this. He had sent it from the Albuquerque telegraph office on the day he was released. It had apparently not arrived. Thomas, the telegraph operator in Caldero, had been having consistent difficulties with his equipment that summer, a fact Matilda knew and had forgotten in the architecture of her anger. "Did you intend to come back?" she asked, because she needed to hear it directly. "Always," he said. "From the first moment I left. I never intended anything else. I was trying to protect you, and I did it wrong. I made the decision for you instead of with you, and I know that was wrong, and I am sorry for it more than I know how to say." She looked at him across the table, at the chess board neither of them had touched. "I told you," she said slowly, "on the night we first talked honestly, that I do not like secrets, that I cannot manage not knowing the truth about the people around me." "You did," he said, "and you did the same thing again." "I did," he said, "and I cannot explain it as anything other than fear. I was afraid of losing you, and I made the worst possible choice to try to prevent it." Matilda was quiet for a long time. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a woman who needs to be protected from information. I am a woman who can handle danger and difficulty and hard choices. What I cannot handle is being managed, being kept in the dark, being treated as something fragile when I am not fragile. Can you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. "I understand it completely." "If something like this happens again," she said, "if there is a threat, a danger, a choice to be made, you tell me. We decide together. That is what being married to me means. It is not a compromise. It is the only way this works." "I understand," he said. "I promise you." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said, "Make the coffee," because she had always expressed certain things through the practical. He made the coffee. He made it carefully, the way she had shown him, and brought 2 cups to the table, and they sat across from each other with the chess board between them and the baby making small contented sounds from his crib and the lamp lit against the evening. "You should have seen him 3 weeks ago," she said. "He discovered he had feet." The discovery appeared to genuinely astonish him. Ezekiel smiled. It was the first time in 3 months she had seen that particular smile, the one that was entirely real and entirely his, and it did something complicated to her chest. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. 3 months of Daniel, the milestones and the small things and the funny specific observations of a mother who paid attention to everything. And he listened with the complete focused attention he had always given to the things that mattered to him. And she watched the 3 months of absence between them begin to fill in, not disappear, but become something that could be integrated, made part of the whole. They did not resolve everything that night. The full healing of the wound his leaving had made took time, the way all real wounds take time, and Matilda was not inclined to pretend to faster recovery than was honest. She was cooler with him for several weeks, not cold, not punishing, but measurably more contained, and Ezekiel bore this with patient recognition that it was exactly what he had earned and no more than was fair. What helped was that he was consistently, demonstrably, undeniably present. Every morning, every evening. Every problem that arose on the farm. Every midnight feeding that Daniel demanded with his father's stubbornness. Ezekiel was there without performance, without the anxious demonstrativeness of a man trying to prove something, just genuinely, solidly there in the daily texture of their life. He also, 2 weeks after his return, took Matilda's hand one evening and said, "I want to tell you something about coin." And he told her the full story in detail, including the parts that showed him in a less than flattering light, the misjudgments and the fear and the specific moment he had made the wrong choice. He told it without editing and without asking her to think better of him for it, just presented the full truth and let it be what it was. She listened. When he was done, she said, "Thank you for telling me that. You deserve the full truth," he said, "all of it, even the parts that are not to my credit." "I know," she said. "That is what I have always needed from you." "I know that now," he said. "I am sorry it took me so long to fully understand it." She looked at him, and then she moved across the space between them and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way in the quiet of the farmhouse with the evening outside and the baby asleep in the other room, and the complicated piece of two people who have survived something and come out the other side with all the necessary pieces still intact. By Christmas of 1883, they were more fully themselves together than they had ever been before, which was the specific paradox of having been through something hard and come through it, that the damage, properly healed, made the structure stronger. Christmas in Caldero in 1883 was the kind of Christmas that happened in places that had learned to celebrate without abundance, which was to say it was warm and human and more meaningful for its simplicity. The church held a service on Christmas Eve that the whole town attended, including, to Matilda's satisfaction, the two new families who had arrived that fall and who had been made to feel welcome partly through her own direct effort. Felipe had married a woman from the valley named Rosa who was already expecting their first child, which Matilda considered an excellent development in every way. Marco had decided that farming was his life's work and had acquired a small adjacent parcel that Ezekiel had helped him negotiate. They had Felipe and Rosa and Marco for Christmas dinner at the farmhouse, which meant the table was full and loud, and Daniel was passed from person to person with the sociable tolerance of a baby who had never been treated as anything other than a person of importance. After dinner, when the guests had gone and Daniel had been settled for the night and the dishes were done and the lamp turned low, Matilda and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the mild December dark with blankets around their shoulders and the last of the coffee in their cups and the year in its last week settling around them. "Tell me what you want for the next year," she said. It was a tradition they had started the previous Christmas, a deliberate inventory. "For the farm to keep growing," he said. "For Daniel to keep being exactly as astonishing as he already is. For Felipe and Rosa's baby to arrive healthy." He paused. "For things to be simple for a while." "Simple," she said. "Not boring," he clarified. "Simple, uncomplicated by danger and secrets and Rupert coin. Simple as in this farm, this life, this table, you." She smiled at the dark. "That is a good list," she said. "Mine is similar." "What is different on yours?" She was quiet for a moment. "I would like another child," she said. "When the time is right, Daniel needs company." He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said simply. "And I want to expand the eastern field," she said. "I have been looking at the survey maps. There is water access I have not been using." "Show me," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tonight I am comfortable." He put his arm around her and she leaned in and they watched the stars for a long time, the New Mexico sky being as extravagant as always, offering more stars than you could count or need. "Matilda," he said. "Yes. I need to say something." "Say it." "Thank you," he said. "For the second chance, for the gun on the porch and the cold welcome and the sitting at the table and the telling me to make the coffee, for all of it, for not making it easy and for making it possible anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "You came back," she said. "That was the thing that mattered. You came back." "Always," he said. Spring of 1884 arrived the way New Mexico springs arrived, suddenly and with extravagance, the desert deciding it had been restrained long enough and letting everything bloom at once. The eastern field expansion was underway, the water access that Matilda had identified in the survey maps proving to be exactly as productive as she had predicted. The farm was the most profitable it had ever been. Daniel, at 14 months, was a locomotive. He moved through the world with a decisive forward momentum that suggested he had made a fundamental assessment of it, and found it interesting, and intended to investigate every part of it personally and immediately. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's expression when encountering a problem, which was the focused, slightly impatient look of someone who had already decided to solve it and just needed a moment to work out how. Watching him, Matilda thought about her father, who had taught her to read land and maps and the world's particular language. She would teach Daniel those things, and Daniel would teach them to whatever children came after, and the chain of knowing would extend in both directions, backward through her father and forward through her children. And that was the continuity that mattered, the real thing that people built when they built farms and families in places like this. Archie Flood visited in the spring, on his way through from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, and stayed 2 nights. He was the kind of old friend that Ezekiel had very few of, a man who knew the full history and valued him in light of it rather than in spite of it, and his visit had the comfortable quality of uncomplicated history. He held Daniel with the careful awkwardness of a childless bachelor and said, "He looks like you, Vaughn," which is either a blessing or a warning depending on your perspective. And Matilda laughed and Ezekiel said, "He is considerably better looking than I am." And Daniel chose this moment to grab Archie's mustache with both hands. "He is also opinionated," Archie said. "He comes by it honestly from both directions," Ezekiel said. That evening after dinner, Archie told them that Silas Greer had died in the federal penitentiary in March, a heart condition. He had lasted 3 years, which was more than some had expected and fewer than others had hoped. Ezekiel received this information quietly. There was no celebration in him, which was the right response. There was a kind of release, a loosening of something that had been held taut for so many years that the muscles had forgotten how to relax. He sat with it for a while and then he said, "Good," and meant it as a full statement, comprehensive and complete, not cruel but honest. Matilda refilled his coffee and put her hand on his shoulder as she passed. Later, when Archie was asleep in the spare room, they lay in the dark of the bedroom with the night outside quiet and vast, and Ezekiel said, "I keep expecting to feel more about it." "What do you feel?" she asked. "Done," he said. "Just done with it and glad, and a little tired from having carried it so long." "That sounds right," she said. "I want to write to Daniel's grave," he said. "I know that sounds like I have lost my mind." "It does not sound like that," she said. "It sounds like you. I want to tell him it is over, that Greer cannot hurt anyone else, that he has a nephew. We should visit," she said, "before the summer heat. Take Daniel to Tucson. Let him see where he gets his name from." Ezekiel turned toward her in the dark. "You would do that?" "Of course I would," she said simply. They went to Tucson in May, all 3 of them, Daniel riding in a sling on Matilda's chest because he was emphatically opposed to staying in the travel cart for longer than 40 minutes at a time, and the journey was 2 days. He regarded the desert with the focused scientific interest he brought to everything, apparently finding the saguaro cactus particularly compelling. They stood at Daniel's grave and Ezekiel talked to his brother in the way he had before, with the easy honesty of someone who had made peace with the conversation, and he told him about the verdict and the penitentiary and the farm and the eastern field expansion, and the chess and the coffee and the marriage and this child now named for him, who was currently studying a horned lizard with great seriousness. "His name is Daniel," Ezekiel said. "He is the best thing in the world. You would have liked him a great deal and he would have liked you, and I intend to make sure he knows who you were." Matilda said her words again, quietly, and then she picked up their son and held him up toward the marker in the gentle, slightly performative gesture of someone introducing 2 people who cannot shake hands. "This is your Uncle Daniel," she told him. "He was funny and brave and he was loved. You are named for him because you are lucky to have his name, and I hope you know that always." Daniel looked at the marker with grave attention, and then looked at his mother, and then at his father, and appeared to understand that something important was happening, which was part of his particular gift. They stayed 2 nights in Tucson, which had grown considerably since Ezekiel had last seen it. Growing from the rough frontier settlement, he remembered into something that resembled a real town, with a hotel and a proper courthouse and streets that were at least periodically graded. They ate in a restaurant on Congress Street and walked along the Santa Cruz River in the evening, and Matilda bought a surveying book at a general store that she tucked under her arm with the focused satisfaction of someone who has found exactly what they wanted. The ride home took 2 days and was companionable and easy, the rhythm of travel that two people find when they have been long enough together to move through the world with the same cadence. The second pregnancy announced itself in August of 1884, and Matilda told Ezekiel over breakfast again, in the same direct way. And this time he knew what to do with the feeling and simply stood up from the table and came around to her side and held her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said, and smiled up at him in the private way. The baby arrived in April of 1885, a girl this time, born in a March evening that softened into April just before midnight. She was loud and definite and had her mother's green eyes and what appeared to be her father's opinions about everything. "What shall we call her?" Matilda asked. Ezekiel looked at his daughter for a long time. "Clara," he said. "After my mother." Matilda looked at him. "She worked herself to bone keeping us," he said. "She never got what she deserved. I would like her name to have a life it could not have before." "Clara," Matilda said, testing the name. "Yes, Clara Vaughn." Clara took to the world with the comprehensive ambition that her brother had established as the family default, and together they made the farmhouse the kind of place that was defined by sound, voices and laughter, and the periodic crash of small people, moving with more speed than coordination through spaces that were not quite designed for them. Ezekiel was a father in the specific way of a man who had paid attention to what fathering should look like, and made it his practice, present and consistent and serious about the fun parts, and patient about the difficult parts, and never making the mistake of assuming that being there was sufficient, knowing that being there well was what mattered. He told both children about Daniel, not as a cautionary tale or a tragedy, but as a person, specific and funny and real, a person who had existed and been loved and who still mattered in the particular way that lost people matter to the ones who loved them. Daniel and Clara grew up knowing their uncle as a presence rather than an absence, which was the gift their father could give them. By 1887, the farm was an established and productive operation, one of the more successful in the eastern valley of Caldero, which was no longer quite the rough frontier town it had been, and which now had a proper school and a doctor's office, and a somewhat more reliable telegraph operation, and several new families who had arrived looking for what Matilda and Ezekiel had both, in different ways and from different directions, come to Caldero looking for, which was a place, a real one. Not a place to pass through, but to be. Archie Flood came for a longer visit that summer and brought with him a woman named Helen who he had met in Santa Fe, and who was clearly the most important thing that had happened to him in years. And Matilda liked her immediately, with the speed of someone who recognizes a fellow person of substance. And they spent 2 evenings talking at the kitchen table while Archie and Ezekiel sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing the way old friends do. "You look different," Archie told Ezekiel on the second evening. "Different how?" Ezekiel asked. "Like someone who belongs somewhere," Archie said. "I did not know you were missing that until I saw you with it." Ezekiel looked at the lit window of the kitchen, where he could see Matilda's profile and hear her voice and Helen's voice weaving together in animated conversation. "I was missing it my whole life," he said. "I just did not have a name for what it was. And now," he thought about it. About the farm and the corn and the eastern field and the chessboard and the coffee and the specific green of Matilda's eyes in morning light and Daniel's dark ones and Clara's laugh, which was already exactly like her mother's, deployed sparingly and therefore precious. "Now I call it home," he said. Felipe and Rose's baby had arrived the previous year, a son they named Tomás, and Daniel had become deeply attached to Tomás in the proprietary, protective way of a slightly older child who has decided that a younger one is theirs to look after. Matilda watched this and thought about what it meant to build a life in a place, and how the building accumulated, the layers of connection and relationship and invested care, and how after enough years the layers were what the place was made of. The town was also changing in ways that mattered. The 1880s in New Mexico Territory were years of significant change, the railroad expanding, the land questions becoming more formalized, the populations of towns shifting as more people came west. Matilda watched these changes with the careful attention of someone who understood that change was the condition of frontier places, and that the question was always which direction the change moved. She had become involved in the school when the first teacher had left suddenly, and there was no replacement. She had stepped in temporarily, teaching arithmetic and reading 3 days a week, and the temporary had become regular because nobody else was doing it, and the children needed it, and Matilda Mercer Vaughn was constitutionally incapable of identifying a need and not meeting it. Ezekiel had watched this development with the specific pride of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by his wife's capabilities, but whose appreciation of them had continued to deepen. He had also, that year, taken on a formal role as something between a foreman and a mediator for the Eastern Valley Farms, a loose collective that had developed organically among the dozen or so farms in the area as they had recognized the practical advantages of shared resources, shared water rights negotiation, shared market access. It was work that used the skills he had actually spent his drifting years developing, the reading of people and situations, the understanding of how individual interests could be aligned without coercion, the ability to hold multiple complicated facts simultaneously and find the point where they converged. He was, at 37 in 1887, the kind of man he had wanted to be when he was 20 and had believed was not available to him. He was honest in his work and his life and his relationships. He was steady. He was respected without requiring that respect. He was loved by people he deserved to be loved by, which he considered the most important measure. And he was loved by Matilda, which remained the central fact of everything. One evening in the fall of 1887, they were on the porch again with the coffee and the stars, which was their enduring ritual, the place where all the real conversations happened. The children were asleep. The farm was quiet. The air had the particular quality of autumn evenings in the high desert, clear and cool and full of a wildness that the settlement had not quite tamed. "I want to ask you something," Matilda said. "Ask," he said. "Do you remember the night I asked you if you believed in second chances?" "Clearly," he said. "What were you thinking when you said what you said? When you said I came back, didn't I?" He considered this seriously, the way she always asked him to consider things. "I was thinking that the act was the answer," he said. "That no amount of words would be adequate, and that the only thing I could say that was fully true was the physical fact of my presence. I was there. I had chosen to be there. That was what I believed about second chances, that they are not declared, they are enacted." She was quiet for a moment. "I was terrified," she said. "When I saw you on the path, I was more terrified than I had been of Greer, because Greer could only take the farm. You could take something more important." "I know," he said. "And I was relieved in a way I was furious about," she said. "Because I had spent 3 months constructing a version of my anger that did not include relief in it, and then you appeared and the relief was there anyway, and I was very annoyed with myself." "You did not show it," he said. "No," she said, "but you knew." "I did," he said. The gun was shaking slightly at the very end. She made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "Do not tell me that," she said. "Let me believe I was completely composed." "You were composed," he said. "The shaking was barely visible. You were magnificent." She looked at him. "Are you happy, Ezekiel?" Yes, he said, without qualification or elaboration, just the single complete word. Genuinely, more genuinely than I knew how to be 7 years ago, he said. More genuinely than I believed was possible when I rode out of Caldero that morning with Archie's telegram in my coat and your face burned into the back of my eyes. Yes, I am happy, he looked at her. Are you? Yes, she said with the same completeness. They sat in the quiet and the stars did their extravagant thing, and the farm settled around them in the particular piece of a thing that has been built well and is resting between days. Ezekiel, she said eventually. Yes, I am expecting again. He turned to look at her. The lamp from the window caught her face and she was watching him with that completely unguarded expression. The third time you have told me this, he said, and it still does the same thing to my heart. Is that a complaint? She asked. It is the opposite of a complaint, he said. She smiled. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, as she always let him, with the specific grace of someone who chooses to allow what they want without making either the choosing or the wanting into a performance. A daughter, they would name her Josephine, after the gray mare that had been there from the beginning, and who was now aging gracefully in the paddock, and still regarded the world with the composed, slightly judgmental air of a horse who had seen a great deal and formed considered opinions. She would arrive in the summer of 1888, healthy and loud and green-eyed again, and she would grow up knowing the farm the way her mother knew it, as a living thing that spoke in the language of seasons and water and the specific literacy of people who pay attention to the earth. But that was still a year ahead. For now it was the fall of 1887, and the porch and the coffee and the stars, and Matilda Mercer Vaughn and Ezekiel Vaughn sitting together in the dark with their hands joined, and the life they had built around them in all its accumulated, complicated, hard-won beauty. He thought about the morning in 1880 when he had ridden down a path toward a woman in a cornfield, and she had looked at him with those assessing green eyes, and asked him if he could follow directions without needing them explained twice. He thought about the first chess game and the first real conversation, and the night on the porch when she had said you could stay in the quiet voice of a person who means it completely. He thought about Daniel, who was gone but not absent, present in the name his nephew carried, and in the way Ezekiel tried to move through the world with the lightness his brother had always managed, the gift for making rooms better. He thought about the porch and the gun and I came back, didn't I, in her face in that moment, furious and grieving and relieved, and all of it so entirely hers. He had come back. He would always come back. There was nowhere else in the world that was his in the way this place was his, nowhere else that had the specific quality of a thing that fits, and he understood now that this was what home meant. Not just a place you return to, but a place that makes the returning the most natural thing in the world. A gravity so right you do not experience it as force, but simply as direction. South of Caldero, the desert ran on in the particular darkness of an unpolluted sky, the same desert that had been there before any of them and would be there after, indifferent and magnificent, holding the bones of everything that had come before in its red and ochre earth. The stars above it were the same stars that had hung above every version of this landscape, the Spanish missionaries and the Apache and the Navajo and the settlers and the drifters and all the people who had looked up and felt the same irreducible fact of being small and here and alive. Matilda squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The lamp burned in the window. The children slept. The farm breathed in the autumn dark. And Ezekiel Vaughn, who had come to Caldero as a man with nothing but a dark past and a purpose, sat on the porch of the life he had made with the woman he loved and felt, in the most complete and honest way he had ever felt anything, that the world was exactly the right size.